Let's take a closer look at the ProRaster user interface. Today I'm using ProRaster Premium. So firstly, if you go to the System menu, you'll see there's an About ProRaster dialog box. You can check that out. There's also an Options dialog box. These are the settings or preferences. I won't explain them now, but you can reset them to default if you change things and are not happy with your changes. So you start with the Open button. This is a menu button, so you can drop it down. You can open an algorithm, or you can build a new algorithm from a raster or from a raster source. Or if you use MapInfo and you've already rendered a raster in MapInfo, then it will have created a GHX file and stored it next to the raster. And in that GHX file, there's information about how you've rendered that raster. So that can be copied by ProRaster, and it can build an algorithm to render a raster that looks the same as the output you got via that GHX file. So that's an option there. And then you can create a new algorithm. Each new algorithm will have a particular kind of layer in it, and then you can add additional layers later on. Finally, you can select from this list of recently accessed rasters. So let's load up a raster. So once we load a raster, the tree becomes populated with the algorithm, the layers, and then the components in each layer. You can collapse or expand that tree. Let's open a second raster, or maybe even a third one as well. This one takes a little bit longer to open. So ProRaster will edit multiple algorithms simultaneously. So once you've opened an algorithm, it appears in this list. So you can switch between algorithms that you have open as you see fit, and then edit that algorithm that you've selected. Alternatively, you can unload an algorithm. So this button here closes the current algorithm. So I can close that and it goes away. Over here you can save the algorithm, or you can save it as a different file name. So to start off with, you use Save As, and then later you can use the Save button. Up on the title bar, it will tell you whether the algorithm's been saved or whether it's modified, and it will require saving. So over here we have the controls for editing an algorithm. So let's perhaps go to this one. So firstly, we can add additional layers into this algorithm. So I can add an RGB color layer, and here it appears on top. With these buttons, I can delete selected layers. So I can take that layer that I just added and delete it again. These buttons move the selected layers up and down, remembering that the order in which these layers appear in this tree is the order in which they'll be rendered, and they're rendered from the bottom up to the top. And so that anything that's on the top or higher than some other layer might potentially overprint that other layer. So I can move that Greenland layer down, and then I can move it back up again. And you can see that in the view, those changes are immediately reflected. If I make edits, so for example, I come in here and decide change this description. Greenland as a white ice cap. Whenever I have a field like this where I'm typing something in ProRaster you can hit enter to signal to ProRaster to accept that change. So if I hit enter, you see that the view then updates itself. In other applications, hitting enter would usually go straight to the OK button and it would close the dialog. Not in ProRaster, so it's safe to hit enter in any of the dialogs that you open in ProRaster or from the main dialog. Up here you have undo and redo buttons. So you can see, and these are menu buttons, you can drop them down. You can see that I've just changed the layer description, and that's listed in the undo list. So I can undo it, and it goes away. Or I can redo it again and bring it back. So for any of these rasters that you're editing, undo and redo are always available. Layers and components can be enabled and disabled. So if I come to this layer, you'll see that on the first property page there's an enable property. And this is mirrored over here in the tree, and it's more convenient to turn things on and off here in the tree. So if I turn off the Greenland layer, you see that the white ice cap rendering of Greenland layer then disappeared. I can turn it back on again, and it comes back on. If we go down to something like the terrain layer, for example, we have color and hill shading at the moment, the intensity. I'm going to turn off the intensity, and then we get a flat display with just color. Turn it back on again. You can also turn off color, in which case you'll get just the intensity display, the hill shading. So with a component, you can turn basically any components on or off as you see fit, and it will render what's left. Although you can't have just an opacity layer component turned on without any other components. That can't operate on its own. But generally speaking, if you've got color or image or red, green, blue, they can be turned on with or without intensity, or you can have intensity on its own. So when you go into the property pages, for example, here I'm on the terrain shadow property page, so I can move the sun direction around as I see fit, and as you do, those things are immediately reflected in the rendering. So you can here have let's turn off the highlight. So here we have a sun vertically above, and if we zoom in a bit, we have this kind of odd looking effect. Normally you would put sun out here at about 60 degrees, and then you get that hill shading effect. So whenever you change anything in the property page, it's immediately reflected in the rendered view, and it appears up here in the undo redo list. Sometimes when you're building or editing an algorithm, your view in the map window will suddenly go blank. Let me demonstrate this. So if I create a new image algorithm, and I go to the image page, and I connect it to a raster source, so I'll use this land cover classification at the color band. So there's my algorithm working perfectly well. Now if I turn on the intensity component, the preview goes blank. So the algorithm engine has decided that the algorithm is no longer valid, and that's because I have a component turned on but not connected to any data. I haven't chosen a raster source for this intensity component. So if I choose a raster source, then the algorithm becomes valid and it starts rendering again. So that's something to look out for, and usually it will mean that, that you have a component in a layer that's not connected to data. If you have something like a lookup table color layer, it can also be triggered if the color layer doesn't have a data transform. So you must have a data transform specified to convert from data to color. And if that's not valid, then the algorithm may be found to be invalid and it won't render. So in addition to those controls, we also have down here 4 resource editors: your raster source editor, data conditioning editor, data transform editor, and color table editor. So if you press on any of these buttons, it'll bring up a separate dialog where you can add and delete and edit different kinds of resources that can then be included in your algorithm. Over here we have the Publish button. This is for users of the latest version of MapInfo Pro and allows the MRD to be immediately published to a executing version of MapInfo Pro. So it doesn't ask you any questions. The MRD needs to be saved. If it hasn't been saved, it will save it itself. and your preview will appear in MapInfo Pro. This is the export dialog. So this is for outputting the algorithm to a rendered located image raster. You can do it at any resolution, and there are various formats that are supported, and that's the way that you'll get a rendered algorithm into a piece of software like QGIS or ArcGIS. Finally, down here we have the help button, and then the save and close and cancel buttons. So the save and close button is what you would normally call the OK button on a dialog. But it just is spelled out here as save and close. So when you hit this OK button, any algorithms that have been modified and have already been saved as something will then be saved when you close the dialog. If you hit cancel, they won't be. And there are some options around this. So if you go into the options dialog, there are a few things here. Save modified algorithms on OK. Save new algorithms on cancel. So there's some advanced options there for controlling what happens when you hit these buttons to close ProRaster.